Hello and welcome to Bad Movie Beatdown, and it's that time once again where I choose my picks for the best and worst films of 2018. At least it isn't out in April this time. This time I've just about managed to match my total of over 100 films viewed from the previous year, although I will admit that at the end of 2018 itself it was just over 70, and I spent much of January binge watching all the films I missed or have bought on DVD. I was much more up to the minute than I was the previous year and managed to see most of the year's major films and reviewed quite a few on Projector, which was actually so busy there was quite a number I didn't find time to cover there. Luckily a few of those will pop up here. If this is your first time here, or if you need a refresher, here's the rules, so to speak. It has to have been first released to a paying audience in 2018, so films that first played at festivals in 2017 but weren't properly released till the following year count, but movies that were first released in 2017 but only arrived in the UK in 2018 do not. So a film like The Shape of Water doesn't qualify because otherwise it gets very confusing. It goes without saying that I obviously didn't see everything. For example, I didn't rush out to see Fantastic Beasts, The Crimes of Grindelwald and the like, and this isn't completely set in stone. This is purely meant to be how things stand at roughly the end of the year with the films that I've seen. Personally speaking, 2018 was a bit of a turbulent year for me, especially given my departure from a certain website. What was that called again? Anyway, subjectively speaking, 2018 felt like a mini decade onto itself, where the events that happened at the beginning of the previous year feel like they already occurred eons ago. However, with regards to the quality of the films coming out last year, it does feel like it was a fairly strong showing, where you had great films popping up even during the quieter months. However, it would be noted that the misfires seem to be even more spectacular than usual this time out. So, with our attention turned to that, let's look at my picks for the worst films of 2018, all ranked alphabetically, that very much distinguish themselves by their badness. The Bombing, aka Airstrike. The story of this would-be Chinese blockbuster is almost as chaotic off-screen as it is on it. Shot in 2015 for a 3D release, which was cancelled, it's found its release delayed even further when it found itself involved in the Fan Bingbing tax evasion scandal because she has a tiny cameo in the movie, and then its Chinese release was cancelled altogether when it was insinuated that itself might have been a money laundering operation and has led directly to a major slowdown of the entire Chinese film industry. Holy moly! The film is set during the Japanese bombing of Chongqing in World War II, and Bruce Willis turns up to teach the Chinese pilots how to shoot down the Japanese Zeros. Willis gives a performance that is almost triumphant in its apathy, even by his modern day standards. Not only does he awkwardly parrot badly translated dialogue without even bothering to correct it, but he also alternates between clean-shaven and stubble throughout the entire movie, and then, in one jaw-dropping moment, actually does a Christopher Walken impression as he recounts the Watch story from Pulp Fiction, smirking as he realises that he pranked the Chinese director and it found its way into the movie. He's not the only big name associated with this film. Mel Gibson is listed as some kind of consultant on it, and Adrian Brody and Bruce's daughter Ruma have blink or you'll miss it supporting roles that are apparently cut down massively during editing because apparently we needed to spend more time focused on a mahjong tournament in a war movie. The aerial dogfight sequences are also atrocious, featuring woeful CGI that is sub-PlayStation 2 graphics recycled over and over again, and it's not just a terrible piece of propaganda, it also ranks up as probably being one of the worst war movies ever made. Escape Plan 2, Hades. If you're an action film fan, you may recall 2013's Escape Plan, which teamed Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger that made 4 times as much money internationally as it did in the US, especially from China. Now we have this sequel, the first of 2 shot back to back, that was released direct to DVD in America, but was theatrically released in many other territories, but was primarily made for China. I, however, would argue that it's made for absolutely no one because it is singularly dreadful. Marvel. Arnie wisely bails on this series and is replaced by Batista in a glorified cameo alongside a sleepy looking Stallone, and while they're top billed, they're not actually the leads. They're simply there to dupe Western audiences into watching this. The actual leads are Wang Xiaoming and Chen Tang, who find themselves in a top secret facility called Hades, an automated revolving prison that is so ludicrously sci-fi that it makes the one in Fortress look plausible by comparison. There are robots with healing lasers! Directed by Stephen C. Miller, who helmed those Bruce Willis direct-to-video movies and doing an even worse job here with a ceaselessly spinning camera and a numbing soundtrack that gives you a headache, the most surprising thing about this movie is that it's supposedly written by Miles Chapman, who wrote the first movie, even though it feels nothing like it. And in fact, the whole idiotic plot revolves around a top secret patent, which is an oxymoron in terms. That's why this is easily my pick for the worst film of 2018. It is utterly pointless and is actually a massively deceptive movie, and the fact that there's a threat of another film just as bad as this one is almost enough to make me yearn for solitary confinement. Gotti and Speed Kills. That's right, managed to making a special double entry for John Travolta, who managed to star in not one but two terrible crime biopics this year. Of course, the one that everyone knows about is Gotti, starring Travolta as the infamous Teflon Don, who is given a surprisingly sympathetic treatment by the film despite being a murderer, and is directed by someone who clearly saw Goodfellas about a dozen times but didn't actually understand it. But slipping by most people's radars is Speed Kills, which not only shares many of the same countless executive producers as Gotti, but also so many of the same problems that it's virtually the same film. Both of them stumble through their narratives with no sense of time or pacing about what's happening. They have huge amounts of exposition from Travolta that either explains the obvious or tries to fill in the holes of their craptacular script when he's not running around in terrible wig and eyebrow combos yelling expletives at people. At least Gotti is an entertainingly bad film though. Speed Kills looks like it's genuinely unfinished. There are several scenes of people racing around on speedboats where they forgot to dub in the dialogue. There's a terribly rendered CGI storm sequence, and at one point a big close-up on a typo of the word subpoena. No wonder the director of Texas Chainsaw 3D took his name off Speed Kills, although personally, John Lucenhop, if you are going to do that, maybe take your name off the writing credits as well. Holmes and Watson. When Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly first teamed up in Talladega Nights, it was a pleasant surprise, especially because Reilly was more known for his serious acting at that time, and they replicated the magic a few years later in Step Brothers. However, in 2018, the bloom had certainly come off the rose, especially because there was one missing ingredient, that of Adam McKay, despite Ethan Coen's feeble attempts to try and replicate him. Holmes and Watson feels uninspired right from the very start, not just because Sherlock Holmes has been over-adapted recently, but also because it's a very specific parody of the Guy Ritchie Sherlock films that are almost a decade old by this point. There's a staggering level of talent in this movie, like Ray Fiennes, Kelly MacDonald, Rebecca Hall, Rob Brydon, Steve Coogan, even a musical number by Alan Menken of all people, all wasted in service of a film that thinks anachronisms are the height of comedy. But the biggest waste is Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly themselves, who in trying to recreate their signature silliness are just left flailing around trying to prop up dead jokes. Literally at one point involving a dead queen that feels subjectively like it lasts for a week. Perhaps the funniest thing about this film is that Sony was actually trying to flog it off to Netflix despite its starry cast, and even they wouldn't take it because the quality is so low here there are several shots which are out of focus. Even more perplexingly, Sony actually released this in multiple versions in different territories, which would perplex even the great detective himself. Otherwise, it's shit, Sherlock. Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom. Remember in the original Jurassic Park where Jeff Goldblum's Dr. Malcolm goes on a long rant to John Hammond and his men about the fact that they were so preoccupied with whether or not they could do things, they didn't stop to think if they should before they packaged and merchandised it? Someone should tell that to the people that keep reviving this franchise, because I was certainly channeling his disgust while I was watching Fallen Kingdom, which takes the rotten cynicism of Jurassic World and plows headfirst into stupidity. Even from the very start, the plot is riddled with holes, like the fact that it teases an extinction plot while apparently forgetting there was a whole second island of dinosaurs, and then it blows its load very early on with a volcano sequence that apparently learns its rules of lava from a school playground. Much of the film after that is set in the darkened corridors of an enormous mansion so big that it can apparently house a T-Rex inside of it, which is also dreadfully boring as a setting and lacks the grandeur of the previous film. The script here is one of the worst for a major blockbuster in recent memory, featuring such moments as dinosaurs being bought at auction for less than the price of a Premiership footballer, a military application dinosaur that needs a rifle to point its target, and Chris Pratt apparently being immune to the effects of lava, an ash cloud, and falling off the cliff. And I've not even mentioned the forehead slapping ending that sets up another installment that promises to be absolutely bonkers, but not before Goldblum himself turns up as Malcolm in a pair of bookending scenes that he probably shot in a day. Maybe he should have thought if he should have done that as well. The Predator. Shane Black had a small role in the original Predator in 1987, and given the critically acclaimed films that he directed, like Kiss Kiss Bang Bang and The Nice Guys, it seemed like he was well suited to revive this franchise, which only makes this disaster all the more crushing. Given the well-documented production troubles, it's no surprise that The Predator is a mess, and a wildly inconsistent one at that, suggesting that whatever we got in the finished product bears very little resemblance to whatever this started out as. That's not to say that that was particularly good either, given the crux of the plot is that the Predators are basically hunting Jacob Tremblay for his autism that they believe is the next step of evolution, which is one of many bewildering decisions this film makes. The original Predator had memorable characters to spare, but here they're either utterly bland or obnoxious, especially the band of misfits that includes Keegan-Michael Key and Thomas Jane, who all seem to be competing against each other to be the wild card in misjudged comedy scenes, and Sterling K. Brown, who arrives as a seemingly important character that actually does very little. By the time the obviously reshot finale rolls around, which suddenly becomes a very rushed remake of the first film, it's clear that this franchise revival isn't hunting for sport, it's begging to be put out of its misery. Show dogs. Heir-to-turn-director Raja Gosnell has certainly made a career out of talking dog movies, be it Scooby-Doo or Beverly Hills Chihuahua, and generally sending a chill down every parent's spine when they see his name on a family film. But even by his standards, he's outdone himself with the wildly awful buddy comedy Show Dogs, which pairs FBI agent Will Arnett with police dog Max, voiced by Ludacris, who have to go undercover at a Las Vegas dog show to find a stolen, terrifyingly CGI panda, although, let's be fair, most of the other CGI work in this film is pretty horrifying in its own right. Show Dogs attained infamy when it had to be recut in the US to remove a small subplot where Max had to find his happy place to avoid focusing on the judges inspecting his testicles, and in general the film has a rather puzzling fixation on dog private parts. I will say I've seen the uncut version, and nothing quite prepares you for the bizarre sequence where Will Arnett and Max perform the lift from Dirty Dancing surrounded by love hearts, followed by the song I'm Sexy and I Know It, which is one of the most tone-deaf needle drops ever. Will Arnett looks visibly, rightfully embarrassed, especially when they reference his Lego Batman persona several times, and there's also a climax where the characters are threatened with getting mulched in a plane propeller. Who is this movie for? Oh, and the titular Beverly Hills Chihuahua herself turns up in a cameo, saying, well, no one makes talking dog movies anymore. Yeah, and films like Show Dogs are the reason why. Surviving Christmas with the Relatives. This British comedy, which attempts to recreate the all-star festivities of Love the Coopers and The Family Stone, is almost intolerable. This Christmas farce from the writer of Fatal Attraction of all things is utterly mirthless, and it fails to give any kind of Christmas spirit from watching it, and the weak gags are feebly executed. Scenarios like a dog eating Viagra or kids catching their aunt with a vibrator are more desperate than humorous. Try to imagine National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation on horse tranquilizers and you'll get some idea of what it was like to watch this in an empty cinema on a Monday in December. Although it has a very large cast, most are given almost nothing to work with James Fox simply wheeled on for a risible gag about low blood sugar, and lead Julian Ovenden isn't so much playing it straight as weirdly intense. Mostly it's a lot of rich people problems, with a load of spiteful, unlikable characters getting into petty spats, combined with a highly improbable drug-taking subplot where Ovenden has to take his pot-smoking son into rehab on Christmas Day, and he's already broken out by the time Boxing Day rolls around. The uncomfortable experience is much the same as breaking into the Christmas party of a total stranger for 100 minutes, although even that would probably be better company than this Christmas turkey. Terminal. Margot Robbie had a huge success with I, Tanya, which was made through a production company, but she was probably thankful that everyone was paying attention to that, and not this wildly indulgent pile of dreck that she also produced. Set in some nondescript stylized city in its railway terminal and diner, that mostly looks like the large empty studio that it is, this clearly only got made because Robbie wanted to play a femme fatale with an English accent, doing multiple costume changes. This is the kind of post-Tarantino sub-Guy Ritchie imposter that clogged up video stores 15 years ago with a much more starry cast. So we have Max Irons and Dexter Fletcher as a pair of bickering hitmen waiting around in an apartment, a miscast Mike Myers playing a railway janitor with a secret, and Simon Pegg playing a terminally ill teacher contemplating suicide, who is largely irrelevant to the proceedings, but does manage to pad out the movie with extended dialogue scenes as Robbie cheerfully suggests methods of death. It's the kind of movie that thinks it's way smarter than it actually is, inserting a load of Lewis Carroll references because it wants to be surreal as it blithers its way towards a series of twists and reveals that are as obvious and heavily signposted as they are implausible, a painful embarrassment for all involved. Venom. And finally my pick for so bad it's good is Venom, which managed to be enormously successful despite being hilariously awful. Or maybe because of it. Tom Hardy plays investigative reporter Eddie Brock, who after 40 minutes of uneventful mediocrity gets infected with an alien symbiote called Venom, and it's at that point the movie turns into a laugh riot. Bypassing body horror almost entirely, Hardy instead connects with his inner Jim Carrey, flailing around, eating chicken out of a bin, climbing into the lobster tank in the middle of a restaurant, and making out with the alien. Hardy commits to this absurd quasi-buddy comedy with the kind of intensity normally reserved for the likes of Nicolas Cage, and I spent much of this movie watching it in a state of nirvana that I only get from the right kind of enjoyably bad movie. You've got talented actors like Michelle Williams and Riz Ahmed looking visibly embarrassed as they try to utter some of the worst dialogue of their careers, a plot that could generously be described as absolute nonsense, and CGI fight scenes that are borderline incomprehensible and are basically two blobs smashing into each other. And then, as a cherry on top, Woody Harrelson turns up wearing the end of a mop dyed red on top of his head for some hilariously on-the-nose sequel bait, and you know what? If they can keep up with this kind of manic, misguided energy, sign me up for Venom 2, please. So now that we've exorcised the demons, it's time to celebrate some of the films that I most enjoyed and appreciated during the year, and the fact that it's such a wildly variable crop speaks to how great some of the films released in 2018 were. Here are my picks of some of the year's best films in alphabetical order. Black Panther. Ryan Coogler does for the Marvel films what he did for the Rocky franchise in Creed by reinvigorating it from a new perspective, making it feel dynamic and exciting again. Black Panther has a very strong identity, meaning it works exceptionally well as a standalone adventure, but also you can see this in the production design of Wakanda and its Astrofuturism, creating a place with a strong sense of culture and tradition, but also highly advanced in terms of its technology and aesthetic that feels like nowhere we've ever been on screen before. It's between those two worlds that T'Challa, commandingly played by Chadwick Boseman, must choose between as Wakanda's new ruler. Does he continue hiding their existence from the rest of the world no matter the cost, or does he embrace an open future, sharing their innovations? The cast in general is absolutely terrific, with Michael B. Jordan practically stealing the show as the villain Killmonger in a spectacular performance that easily ranks as one of the most memorable antagonists Marvel has ever had, and also a star-making turn from Letitia Wright as T'Challa's younger sister and inventor Shuri. Black Panther is the first superhero movie to be nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars, and it's very easy to see why, because this is blockbuster filmmaking at its finest, and is easily among the very best of its genre. Colette. Keira Knightley has quietly become a fantastic actor, and if you need proof of that, look no further than this biopic of the titular French author, which offers probably her best performance to date. Colette begins the film as a young woman from a rural background, marrying wealthy older man of the city Willie, well played by Dominic West, who is heavily reliant on ghostwriters. He loves her because he believes that he can control her, but Colette is far more distinct and resilient than the naive girl that he thinks she is, which only becomes clearer over time. This is a film about identity in its numerous forms. When Colette writes about her experiences by creating the character of Claudine, she creates a sensation that everyone in Paris seeks to emulate and claim as their own that changes even her, and because it was published under Willie's name, it begins a long battle of recognition. Needless to say, that alone would make this historical tale exceptionally relevant and timely in our modern world, but also Colette explores her sexuality, including a scandalous affair and later a relationship with Missy, both of which also transform her, and Knightley does a fantastic job of portraying someone coming into their own and also asserting and reclaiming who she is. Colette was a pleasant surprise when I saw it that has only grown in my mind as I look back upon it. The Favourite. I'll admit that costume drama is a hard genre for me to connect to, but The Favourite is anything but musty. Through the warped lens of Yorgos Lanthimos, literally in the case of his signature fisheye lenses and other pieces of unusual cinematography, the film becomes a wickedly funny satire of the excesses and rivalries of the upper classes that boasts three exceptional lead performances at the centre of it. Olivia Colman is brilliant as Queen Anne, suffering from gout, who manages to strike the right tone between comedy and tragedy in the role, being both temperamental and childish at points, but also overwhelmed and vulnerable despite her position. Emma Stone and Rachel Weisz play Sarah and Abigail, both competing for the Queen's affections, both in terms of power play and personally, and much of the film's comedy comes from the increasingly nasty manipulations between them and Anne, which would seem frivolous if it wasn't so political. Lanthimos plays up the absurdity of the film, where these ridiculous games go on as the country goes to war, and the stated repressions of the genre are instead replaced by colourful vulgarity, including some impressively creative swearing. This is actually the first of his films that I've seen, and I was concerned that his art style would be off-putting, but I immediately clicked with it, and I devoured the film with the same kind of relish as its leads clearly are. First Reformed. Ethan Hawke gives a marvellous performance as a tormented minister in Paul Schrader's examination of faith and religion in our modern age, where it seems like we're standing on the edge of an apocalyptic precipice. Dealing with issues of climate change, corruption and terrorism, Hawke's Toller wrestles with faith and meaning, trying to work out how he can make any kind of difference with such enormous problems, leading him down a dangerous path. There's a malignancy in Toller, both spiritual and literal, with his weakening body and alcoholism mirroring the poisoning of the planet that he becomes obsessed by, and at times it resembles Schrader's earlier taxi driver in Robes, in how that poison seeps into his faith as well. Hawke is utterly captivating in a complex, challenging role that is in virtually every single scene, and there's strong support from Amanda Seyfried as the pointedly named Mary, who remains a ray of sunshine in Toller's ever bleaker world. The film's sudden, open-ended conclusion did actually floor me for a moment when I first saw it, until I thought upon it further, which is exactly what Schrader wants us to do. He wants us to consider the film's themes and ideas long after it's ended, and in that way, its ambiguity leaves it as subjective as religion itself. The Happy Prince. Rupert Everett spent an entire decade trying to get his passion project made, where he not only stars as Oscar Wilde, but also makes his screenwriting and directorial debuts, and I'm happy to report that it was well worth the effort, with his passion and enthusiasm for the subject evident in every single frame. Charting the final years of Wilde as he lives in exile is the part that Everett was born to play, making sure he retains his signature wit even as his circumstances become more and more self-destructive and heartbreaking, and it takes what could have been morose and gives it life and poignancy instead of simply just tragedy. Equally fantastic is Colin Morgan as Alfred Bosie Douglas, whose relationship with Wilde led to his imprisonment, and Wilde still feels drawn towards despite his allies swearing him not to. Wilde thrives off his youthful energy, but Bosie is jealous, fickle and cruel, and their tempestuous relationship is the heart of the film. Colin Firth and Emily Watson provide support in small roles, and while admittedly Everett is probably more confident in front of the camera than he is behind it, he's still crafted a strong drama that has a better sense of who Wilde was as a person than previous incarnations, as well as a disgust for the injustice and cruelty that tormented his twilight years. The Hate You Give. Angie Thomas's 2017 YA book was an immediate sensation, so it was no surprise the film rights were quickly snapped up not long after. Amanda Stenberg gives a superb performance as Star, the teenage girl who witnesses her childhood friend being killed in a police shooting that ignites racial tensions in the local community. In turn, Star responds to this traumatic event by finding her own voice and speaking out against the injustice and prejudice of the society around her. A key component of the film is Star having to code switch between when she's at home and when she's at a primarily white high school, having to repress certain aspects of her identity, and there's a tension that builds between those two personas until it eventually reaches a point where Star can no longer do so, which I thought was especially well handled by both Stenberg and the movie itself. What's remarkable about this adaptation is just how fearlessly it tackles challenging source material, and the late Audrey Wells, who sadly passed away just before the film was released, does a brilliant job of making sure it's just as incendiary on the screen as it was on the page. George Tillman Jr. solidly directs the film, mostly letting the incredible power and tragedy of the story speak for itself, as well as its palpable anger at the cruelty of a complicit system, and the film feels exceptionally relevant right now, more so than some movies that were actually nominated at the Oscars. I'm talking about you, Green Book. Mission Impossible Fallout. Regardless of what you think about Tom Cruise, his crazy determination to throw himself into a breathtaking, dangerous stunt for our entertainment is admirable, if also terrifying at the same time. His signature Mission Impossible franchise has become a home for these, but Fallout takes the formula and pushes it even further. Any self-respecting action film would be lucky to have just one of the amazing action sequences here, but Fallout keeps a sensational energy from set piece to set piece of largely practical stunts. Whether it's diving out of a plane, getting into a brutal fight in a nightclub toilet, racing his motorcycle against traffic in Paris, falling off the side of a helicopter, or jumping across a building and breaking his foot and still having it included in the film, Cruise apparently embraces inner Jackie Chan, and the stakes of the story are not only high, but so are the stunts as well. There were moments in this film where I was genuinely afraid for his life. What him and Christopher McQuarrie have created here is pure white-knuckle filmmaking, and I have no idea how they're going to top this for the next 2 installments, because this is easily the best Mission Impossible film yet. And how often do you get to say that about a 6th entry in a series? A Quiet Place. Anyone who brought a bag of snacks to a screening of A Quiet Place in cinemas likely knew they made a very serious mistake in the opening moments of John Krasinski's highly effective and very novel horror film. The movie's an absolute marvel of sound design, using the eerie quiet to build enormous amounts of tension and dread in seemingly peaceful seclusion, making every sound feel pronounced, especially when the silence is shattered. In general, the film takes a natural stripped-back efficiency to its story, and especially its dialogue, largely conveyed through sign language to intimate effect, and that simplicity works wonders in getting the audience to focus on the smaller, careful details of this world and how the family have survived. There are some absolutely nail-biting sequences once the monsters do arrive, although actually, let's not even think about nails when it comes to this film, but a lot of this movie functions as a family drama, with Krasinski and his real-life wife Emily Blunt dealing with the unspoken loss and trauma of losing their youngest child, and their determination to go forward, which a lot of this film serves as a metaphor for. By the end of the film, I think the loudest sound in my ears was that of my own breathing, as I found myself especially anxious by the time the finale rolled around. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. We've had many different film versions of Spider-Man over the years, but Into the Spider-Verse adds a whole lot more of them and reiterates the central universal appeal of the character. Featuring the first film incarnation of Miles Morales, brilliantly voiced by Shameik Moore, the character is always at the centre of the story no matter how busy things get around him, as he must learn to embrace who he is and how it defines his version of Spider-Man, in much the same way the film uses perspective to give us a superhero flick like nothing we've seen before. The visual look of this movie is stunningly beautiful and unique, replicating the feel of comic book art in a way that's truly eye-popping to watch, and filled with in-jokes as you would expect from the makers of the Lego movie, and you can tell it's made by people who love the character. The voice cast is also sensational through and through, from Jake Johnson as a jaded alternate universe version of Peter Parker, to Haley Steinfeld as a graceful Spider-Gwen, Brian Tyree Henry as Miles' policeman father, to Nicolas Cage and John Mulaney competing against each other to steal scenes as Spider-Noir and Spider-Ham. Nothing about this movie misses a beat. It's so endlessly inventive that it was one of the year's most purely enjoyable films for me, mixing humour and heart in a way that's hugely empowering. When Miles says anyone can wear the mask, you'll feel like you can fly through the city alongside him. A Star is Born. This latest incarnation of A Star is Born is a tremendous directorial debut for Bradley Cooper and one of the best versions of this story to date. In front of the camera, Cooper is brilliant as the burnt-out musician, charismatic but deeply flawed, and he has spectacular chemistry with Lady Gaga, who also impresses with a vulnerable but quick-tempered character. Behind the camera, Cooper directs knowing that him and Gaga together are captivating, and as such directs scenes in long takes that emphasise the beauty and fragility of their romance and emotions. This iteration has an almost documentary-like grit and authenticity to it that sets it apart from previous versions, helped in large part by a lack of score or non-diegetic music that gives it a stark, revealing quality behind the bright lights of stardom. This gives the songs and their performances even more significance as the characters express their pain and insecurities in powerful ballads led by the show-stopping Shallow. There's strong support from Andrew Dice Clay and Dave Chappelle, but the standout in the supporting cast is Sam Elliott, giving his best performance in years as Cooper's much older brother who loves him but is tired of cleaning up after his messes. What Cooper does here is he takes a familiar tale and makes it new again with some old-fashioned craft, and boy does it work as an effective tearjerker. I hope you've enjoyed listening to my choices, and I would love to know what your picks are for your favourite films of 2018, or maybe even your least favourites. I'm wishing you a safe and prosperous 2019, and I really do hope you keep on enjoying my work, and if you wish to support it, you can go on over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, but until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, beating down bad movies everywhere.